All right. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, or more likely than not, gentlemen, because according to YouTube, my demographic is virtually 100% male. So I'll just say gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us. I am Mr. Patriarch, and today we are joined by Northern Man. How are you doing, sir?
Not bad, not bad. It's been a tough couple of weeks with Lent, but I'm surviving.
Fantastic. Also, apologies to anyone who, for the few-minute delay, we had a connection issue and couldn't hear each other quite well. So, but we got it sorted out, and here we are. So tonight, the question, as the title suggests, is China based or not? So we're going to sort of slowly go in and address this point. But first, some of you may be wondering, who's this Northern Man and why is he an authority on China relative to some, round eye in America or something? So, Northern Man, can you sort of tell us about your current situation?
Yeah, so I came to China in 2016. I lived in the north of England, and there wasn't many opportunities for a graduate without moving to cultureless London. And so when I left university, I wandered around for a year and then was offered a year-long contract, which was the first opportunity I had for an actual long-term pay solution. So I came out here, and it was only supposed to be for a year, but since this is my 5th year here, we'll see how this goes.
Awesome, very good. Yeah, I too have we're in a similar sort of line of work, but I'm working from distance, so I have some experience with Chinese people, but it's basically over a screen. So Northern Man's
to be honest, when
go ahead.
Yeah, to be honest, that was my experience for the first 6 months of 2020 was online. So it would have made a difference if you lived here or not, because they made us all teach online for 6 months.
Okay, gotcha. But and doing that, in my experience, talking online and whatever, that does sort of cue you into a little bit about sort of the ins and outs of a culture. But what really sort of makes it real to you and helps you understand it in a way that you can't really through reading books is if you go and live there yourself. That was sort of my experience, like when I moved to South Africa. I'd read about it. I hear about the farm murders and all that sort of stuff, and then you come here and you're like, well, it's actually better and worse than what I heard, in certain ways. So without further ado, let's address this first question here. Is China based? Take it away.
It's a good question, and it took me a while to think about it, because from my own opinion, I'd say no, but they do have their own saving graces that are pretty much gone in the West right now, and they're looking like they're not going to come back for the foreseeable future. I don't know how you want to approach this, but I broke it down a bit. I figured I'd give some positive first, and then I'd talk about why I don't think it's based.
I think that's a great idea. That sounds a great idea. Yeah, let's do that.
So first off, I'll talk about the stuff that really is based. So the Chinese basically have zero tolerance for outside ideas. They have their culture and they know their culture. And if you're an outsider, it's fairly obvious. I mean, even the Koreans and the Japanese will have a hard time blending in with the Chinese culture, because the people that grow up here, it's incredibly insular unless you're fairly rich. And at school, they're very much taught English in the manner of, this is how to do business, not how to go abroad. So when I was taught French or German at school, it was totally the, oh well, if you went to France, this is how you would survive in France. Whereas in Chinese English class, it's like, here's how to get $1 out of an American. Here's
Yeah,
how to do business with the English.
yeah. Here's how to make those pounds in USD. Yeah.
Exactly. And you're if you ever come here, which I mean is looking pretty difficult anyway because of COVID restrictions, but if you ever do manage to come, you'll notice immediately that you stand out, because the Han Chinese is one genetic lineage, and they do celebrate their so-called ethnic minorities, but they're such a minority of the population that you'll almost never meet them, and they look Chinese anyway. So
Yeah.
it's
And
like
and
it's like a double-edged sword.
yeah, if I can interject here, for people listening, as I understand it, the Han Chinese are the predominant ethnicity, but they're mostly in like northern China, central China, and they go south a bit. But particularly in the south is where you have a concentration of different languages, and to the west in I'm I'm trying to remember the name of it. Not Xinjiang. Anyways, where the Uyghurs live. In the west, you have more
That is
Turkmenic
Xinjiang,
people
yeah.
live there. Yeah, Xinjiang. Yeah, there we go.
Well,
Yeah. Okay.
I'm going to call it Xinjiang for the purposes of this, so that I don't get ejected from the country.
Okay. Good. Yeah, Xinjiang. Yeah. So, yeah, you do have these minorities and the Manchus as well, and there's Hmong people there, but the clear dominant majority is Han Chinese.
Absolutely. Like, I remember once my fiance even said that the Manchu diaspora has basically conformed completely to Han Chinese at this point. I mean, the Manchu language is dying out, and ethnically they interbreed with the Han and are treated under government guidelines as being Han. So make of that what you will.
Okay. And for anyone, little bit of trivia for anyone in the audience, if you look at the thumbnail for this, you will see a Space Marine Chinaman, and that is actually the face of Emperor Qianlong. And I believe he was actually a Manchu emperor. Is that correct?
I'm fairly certain. Yes.
Yeah,
If you ever look at the past of China and you see the peasantry have that weird haircut, which is like the entire shaved head except for the ponytail,
right.
that was actually a sign of submission to the Manchu emperor. So that's why they had that haircut for so long.
Yeah, and the last, the Qin dynasty was Manchu dominated. Is that correct?
I'm fairly certain. I'm honestly not sure on that point, because with the last couple of emperors, they definitely were hated by the people, and most of the stuff I read about them, they were basically once the not the communist revolution, but once Sun Yat-sen's revolution came, they were basically made part of the regular people and just disappeared. Nobody even knows what happened to the emperor.
Huh. Okay. Yeah, because I do remember the last emperor was basically a child when the 1910 revolution occurred, and yeah, he just kind of, like you said, he didn't have some sort of dramatic going out with a bang or killed like the Tsar's family. He just kind of, he's like, all right, I guess I'm not emperor anymore, and that was it.
Especially because he was a child emperor, he had the problem where his entire regime was propped up by his entourage, and as soon as the entourage was done away with, and I've forgotten what they call her, like the empress. She wasn't
Dowager?
the empress as. Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah,
The empress
Dowager.
dowager. She was just as soon as she was gone, it was very easy for them to get rid of the imperial palace and just do away with it entirely.
Right. I know that makes sense. Now, so China, based in some ways, not based in others. So if we go down the list here, so we have clear in-group, out-group preference, essentially. We have
totally, like, completely in-group preference.
Right. And the next one is there's it's culturally insular. So the things that are Chinese, they want to keep Chinese without too much foreign meddling. Is that correct?
Yeah, I know they keep a tight leash on foreign businesses. I know that the foreign businesses here are very easily seized by the government. So they know for sure that if they mess around with the Chinese government, that any possessions that they have on Chinese soil will be seized immediately. So any businesses that do business with the Chinese, whether they like it or not, have to do business with the Chinese government.
Gotcha. So yeah, there's always the threat of expropriation without compensation, as we say here in South Africa. Okay, and based in other ways. So how are sort of gender relations in China compared to the West? Is it still quite a patriarchal society, or is that changing?
I think that's an interesting point to go into, because they pretend that they have gender equality. So there's no restrictions on women formally, because under Mao, they essentially did away with it. Not because Mao was pro-women, but if you read into it, he actually did it to spite women. He believed that Chinese women were soft and that they could only be built up by doing a hard day's labor.
Got to bring these women up to code, yeah. And that would make sense from a from a communist perspective. And I believe in Russia, you saw sort of similar things. So on paper, there's sort of full gender equality, but the mindset of the people in the country kind of gets stuck in the 1950s. So relative to modern Western standards, they would be seen as, pretty old school in that sense. Next, going on. So let's go on to question number 2. So one of the things that I had learned, watching videos or interviews of people in China, is that the effects of Mao's Cultural Revolution had a particularly big effect on what we would think of as the Chinese boomers, essentially. So the modern generation, sort of the younger people, millennials and whatnot, they're actually a little more aloof and not really down with the whole Cultural Revolution stuff in a certain sense. So they've which coincides with the changing dispensation of the regime itself, right? So it's as the CCP has sort of moderated its ideological position somewhat, that sort of trickled down to the people to a certain extent. But the Chinese boomers apparently were the ones who are really hit hard by the Cultural Revolution. What's your take on that?
I'd definitely say they were the hardest hit, but also had the most to gain from the revolution, because they were probably the last dead poor generation in China.
Right.
And they're kind of lucky because with the culture as such, that if they have children, it's expected under the Confucian tradition that their children will look after them. And because of the prosperity of the 70s and 80s, they've been able to ride the prosperity of their kids. But definitely any of them that are childless are pretty much going to work hard for their entire lives. There's definitely a very big age difference between what you will see in and around the communities in China. You'll mostly see old people for a start. I mean, the people that look after the children are always the elderly. There's no kind of formal babysitters.
Yeah, no, that was one thing I noticed in my teaching, is that in almost not every household, but clearly more than half, it's quite normal for there to be multi-generational households. So the grandparents live with the kids, with the grandkids, and the ones who don't are basically still young enough or virile enough and have their own like business operation that they're running or something. So those ones are kind of the exception. But for most retirees, it seems very common that that would be the case where they move in with the kids, which is one thing that is not only unique to China, but I feel has kind of been the norm across history, but it just still sort of persists there. Whereas in the West, that kind of thing has gone by the wayside. One other thing that I recall talking specifically about the ones who sort of went through the Cultural Revolution is that they have a different attitude and tend to be a bit more unpleasant than the younger generations. Is there any validity to that in your experience, Northern Man?
It's definitely the case that they will be ruder, and the most, I don't want to use the term racism because that term is basically moot in our community. It means nothing at this point. But you definitely get the most intolerance of outsiders from the elderly generation, but also the most like interested and like mystical opinion of foreigners that you'll get. I think for the youths, they've been subjected to American culture for so long at this point that foreigners are part of the discourse now. And especially in the tier 1 cities and perhaps even in the tier 2, they'll experience a foreigner at the school that they go to maybe once a week for an hour of English. But with the elderly as well, they're definitely the least educated generation because they suffered with the Cultural Revolution and the school upheaval, which basically destroyed any vestiges of state education that existed. And it was put on hold for most of their youth. There was 10 years where there was no school, and anyone who made a passing at trying to teach kids would be called a traitor to the nation and publicly shamed for it.
Okay, yeah. So that would definitely have sociological effects, and as you say, the Chinese boomers, maybe some of the Gen Xers, are sort of the last dirt farmer generation of China. So they sort of grew up in what we would consider to be extreme poverty in many cases. Now, moving on, this sort of ties in nicely. So China, of course, has its own rich cultural heritage and traditions. Confucianism, so on and so forth, Taoism. But obviously, the Mao's revolution had a pretty devastating effect on that, as I understand it. Like you said, they shut down schools. A lot of historic and religious sites, temples were destroyed. They changed the language to simplified Chinese, which takes away some of the nuance that you'd find in traditional Chinese characteristics. And I was just wondering, it seems inevitable to me that this would have some effect on eroding traditional spirituality, traditional beliefs, customs, and cultures. And my guess is that this would also lead to a spike in a materialist perspective. So, being where you are, what would you say is the prevalence of materialism in your particular surrounding Chinese society?
The thing is that I live in Shanghai, so I'm basically living peak materialism. It's the richest city in China, and everyone here is totally materialistic. You're lucky to go 5 paces without seeing a giant lit up billboard with an advertisement on it, to be honest. I remember hearing Radlib say once in one of the streams for his channel that when he came here, he said it was like going back to a pagan society. And I can definitely see where he got that from, because the little not suspicions, the little superstitions that they have here are so weird to somebody coming from a British Christian background. Like, for instance, if you ever come here and you go to a hotel, and the hotel floors will go 1, 2, 3, and then 5, because the number 4 is cursed in Chinese, because the Chinese number 4 in Mandarin is si, but the Chinese for death is si. So they sound very similar, and therefore the number 4 is completely absent from their society. For example, wow. If you go to China Telecom or any mobile distributor, you can pay for a phone number. Like, you can pay extra to get a lucky phone number, which will have the Chinese lucky numbers in it. But the cheapest numbers that you can get are filled with 4s, and mostly foreigners get those because they're the numbers that are left for them.
Nice. Yeah, that's the thing. My understanding is that Chinese society is pretty atheistic in a certain sense. They don't really hold to religion or traditional faiths much anymore, but the superstitions persist. Has that sort of been your observation?
Definitely. But on the point that you said about them to being totally spiritually devoid, I think back in my edgy teens, when I was a diehard anti-theist, I would have loved this society, because all the kids are like this. They'll say, "Oh, teacher, you believe in Jesus? Isn't that weird? God doesn't exist. Why do you believe in such weird things?" And it's unusual because it's coming from, they're not taught religion. They're not taught to be anti-religious in a sense, but that's just the natural way that they tend to go with the absence of spirituality here. It seems to be a totally materialistic society where to prosper, you either have to do well scientifically or you have to do well monetarily.
Right. The standard by which they measure themselves is fundamentally materialist, it sounds like.
Definitely. And there's a culture of buying things just for the face of it. So, for example, when I lived in Shenzhen, which is a city in the south, I knew somebody Chinese, and they worked what I would consider quite a low wage job, and maybe earning about 250, 300 pounds a month, which, if you're British, that seems very small. Times that by 1.5 to get the dollars. And she went to Hong Kong and took her credit card with her and bought some unbelievably expensive Gucci bag that cost her an absolute fortune, like 10 months' wages. But ugh, that's the kind of culture they have here. They have this culture of you have to show that you have money rather than actually have money. If you spend it on things that make you look rich, it gives you the appearance of being rich, and that's what matters. That gives you social status.
Right. No, that seems to coincide with what I know about Chinese culture as well. So as another example of showing money instead of having money. One of the things that is very common in China, or at least was, is whenever you go to a restaurant and you were inviting people like your friends or, a potential business prospect, you would order just an absurd amount of food, eat a little bit of it, and then throw the rest away. Just to be like, yeah, like I can afford to like buy food, and taking it home was just like, pfft, if you took food home, you were a chump basically. So
Well, it drives my English sensibilities nuts because I came from a fairly, I wouldn't even say working class background, because we lived on a pretty low, our household income was tiny. And so we were taught, you don't waste food, essentially. If there's anything, if your plate isn't clean, you haven't finished. Whereas in China, if you empty your plate, it means you have to order more. And so if you go to a dinner with Chinese people and you've got an empty plate, they will make every effort to fill that plate back up. And the only way you get out of eating is just by leaving food and wasting it. And
yeah,
it drives my fiance nuts because she says, how have they got this culture when they're only 2 generations from a famine? Like the elderly generation here starved, and so many people were killed in that famine, and they still have this culture of wasting food, even among the lower classes.
yeah, just to show how far they've come, man. Like, yeah, we can afford to waste food now. See, look, I ain't worried about where I'm getting my next meal. I'll throw that shit away.
I even heard that it was the culture during the famine for the middle class, whatever vestiges there were of it, and the rich, to still leave the food, to just leave it. And yeah, it drives a man crazy when it goes so against sensibilities that you learn at home.
Yeah, leave it and not give it to the hungry people. That's another thing that I get the impression is that the idea of charity is not really a thing in China. Is that correct?
I remember I saw a study, and I can't remember from which publication it was, that China was the least charitable nation on earth, like the least charitable. There was nothing above it. And I think that was a harsh rep, because the Chinese are charitable and they are fairly kind if you need help. But I feel like I know that I spoke to somebody who said it came out of a culture, and I don't know if it's recent or if it's in the 70s and the 80s or even further than that, that if you help somebody who'd been in an accident, then because you were the one on the scene, and more often than not, if you were in an accident, the perpetrator would try and get out of there as quickly as possible. They would try and sue anyone that helped them and blame them for the accident so that they could at least get something out of it. And so it just destroyed any culture of helping. I mean, I obviously do it because I'm a foreigner and I'm a stupid Laowai. I'm coveted by feelings of love and charity, but I remember a couple of weeks back that I watched some delivery driver come really badly off his bike, like smashing on the pavement. And me and my fiance ran over to pick up the poor guy, and people just carried on walking past him like nothing had happened. And the guy who he stopped for, that caused him to crash, just drove off, just left.
Yeah. Yeah.
I know that it's become a meme on the internet, like these Chinese accident videos where people will have horrific accidents and no one will help them. And I can only assume it's from this culture of being sued for being on the scene, because to be honest, looking at the traditional Chinese values, Confucius teaches that you're supposed to be charitable to others, and Taoism teaches you the same. So it must just be a modern invention.
Yeah, no, I would believe that. One of the things that I think the Cultural Revolution did, and this drive to sort of acquire material affluence, is it increased, it rather decreased the amount of trust within the community. So you ended up having kind of regardless of whatever may have come before, you end up creating a sort of low trust element within your society.
I definitely see that on just a communal basis as well, because even in Chinese communities aren't small by any stretch of the measure. I think the community that I currently live in is about 4,000 to 5,000 people, which is twice as big as the town I grew up in. And that's barely a kilometer by a kilometer community. And because they're just all stacked up on one another and they have their own little flat and they barely speak to their neighbors. I mean, I'm a bad case because I'm a foreigner, and the usual Chinese opinion of foreigners is foreigners don't speak Chinese, especially in Shanghai. Foreigners just come here for business or to go to the university, so they don't speak Chinese. But I've even noticed that most Chinese people have no idea who lives on the floor with them. They'll never get to know people in their own block unless there's some reason, some other ulterior motive for it.
Right. That seems to me, sorry, got a little bit rowdy last night. My voice is a little shot. But
again, the Patriarch cigarette voice.
Yeah. Yeah, I only save the cigarettes for when we go away on weekends, or if I have like a braai with the boys or something. But and then in that way I don't make it too much of a habit. So it was my way to wean myself off. But yeah, you know how it is when the beers get going and the meat's grilling and having a good time. Your voice can get a little bit tore up. Mm-hmm. But anyways, where was I going? Oh, okay, yeah. So what you're talking about there, I find is pretty typical of living in a large city anywhere. I noticed the same thing here, even in South Africa. So for a time, my wife and I lived in Cape Town, pretty much downtown in the city. And yeah, we didn't talk to anybody either. They didn't talk to us, really.
Yeah, I also think. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I also think it relates back to the fact that there's no spirituality here either. So there's not even church as a reason to come together.
Yeah, no, that's certainly true. And the times where we would talk to people, it would either be, you just run into them in the elevator or, at church and that'd be pretty much it. Not a lot of socialization. But as soon as we came out of the city and moved to a smaller town, that all changed to a big extent. We're still pretty, keep to ourselves a little bit, but we got good relations with our neighbors. We know their name. They ask us for help. We ask them for help. So I would be interested to see to what extent that sort of plays out in the Chinese country vis-a-vis the Chinese cities as well.
I would say from personal experience that it's hard to judge from a foreigner's, knowing other people here that are foreigners that live outside of the tier 1 cities. Most foreigners still remain outsiders, and they'll be even less likely to be approached in a tier 2 or tier 3 city, but just because the standard of English education just drops off like a mountain when you go outside of the city, and the culture becomes even more insular. Like they're even less likely to watch Western TV or even seen a Western movie. Nice.
No, based. Based, yeah. There you have it, folks. Show's over. China's based. So yeah, that seems to be the case also here even in South Africa a little bit. There's a big divide between people who live in and around the metro areas and people who live in small towns. So just as an example, I'll be inside the city and everybody speaks English, but the further and further out you get, the more and more Afrikaans you hear. And basically, if you go to like some of these small towns there's plenty of people who don't speak English at all, and so you'll have you'll be talking to some colored, which not a slur. YouTube colored means mulatto here, but some colored kid will come up to you and start talking in Afrikaans, and then if you don't know any, and then you're in trouble, and and he doesn't know.
You're an outsider either. And you're a target.
Yeah. But is that sort of the is that kind of thing similar in China? So like once you get out of the cities, the countryside's a lot more poor. Some places, does it have lots of poverty still? I would imagine. So is that split still there in China?
So even when we went to a tier 2 city like Nanjing, which was the ancient capital of China, it didn't take long off the beaten route to find poverty. Once you get out of the tourist areas, once you get out of the main business areas, the wealth drop off is so apparent. It's so apparent. Like suddenly you get to concrete washed floors and everyone lives in one room and sleeps in another, and it's only a 2-room apartment. And it's a 3-generational household where grandma and granddad live with mum and dad who live with the kids.
Okay, yeah. No, I thought that was still certainly the case, and even in the countryside, things are quite a bit different as well. Have you been outside of sort of the cities and rented a motorcycle and ripped around the farms or anything like that?
I haven't, but it's only because the opportunity is quite difficult. Because I know I have done it in Guangzhou because the rules are fairly lax there, especially for foreigners, and there's no way the Chinese police would ever be brave enough to pull you over in the outskirts. So if you're on a motorcycle, you can go on for ages. I mean, you could be breaking the traffic laws, and all the Chinese will tut and hiss and give you snide looks, but the police will wave you on because they just don't have the balls to stop you.
They're getting paid regardless. Yeah.
It's cool. Their job to collect people who can speak Chinese so that they can fine them, not to enforce the law. So,
yeah, and that's another thing that I've heard is a big deal in China is corruption. Do you see signs of that around you as regards if hospitals or police or anything else, business dealings? To what extent is corruption a big issue in China?
I'll be honest. I think that I've never seen it overtly because I've been here since Xi has been in power, and he has made a great effort to get rid of it. One thing that he can definitely be applauded for in terms of improving the Chinese nation is the aspect of getting rid of corruption, because it's pretty much absent these days. They collect fines. They collect the fines that are based in law, and they will fine you whatever the fine is for riding without a helmet or breaking the speed limit. But they're not just going to pull you over and say, you give me $1,000 and well, not that much, but I mean, you give me 100 yuan and you can keep going, kind of stuff. You just don't see it. You don't see it.
Okay.
Not in the tier 1 cities anyway.
Right. Yeah, and I would I would suspect that in a lot of these wealthier cities that is the case, because they're sort of the showcase, right? The face of China.
Exactly.
To the international world. And as we, as you and I know, the Chinese are very big about saving face at all cost.
Yes. I will say I have experienced one aspect of it, and I went to because I lived in Shenzhen, I used to often try and look for extra work to supplement the wage, and I was offered like just a passing weekend tutoring job in a tier 6 city, which I didn't even know the tiers go that low, but apparently they do. Yeah, a tier 6 city, which is because China doesn't have towns, that is essentially the designation of it. But it's a different world. It's a different world. I remember asking the center, will there be a problem if the police officers come? And they just said, oh, there'll be no problem. We'll just have to pay them off again. Like, that's just the way that life works out there.
Yeah, no, definitely. And that's the thing is I would imagine, you know, with these new corruption measures and or counter corruption measures and stuff, that visible corruption goes down. But like if you're, you know, in business and you're trying to, you know, make this deal happen, or you got to work with the government official for zoning, or you want a little bit extra special treatment at a hospital, bribes still go on essentially.
I'd also say that they've just capitalized on it because they were smart, and they figured, well, we could get rid of corruption, but we could also make some killer legal dollar off this, because they now have like, oh, you could just pay 200 yuan to fast track this, or pay 500 yuan so you don't have to wait 2 weeks for the government to process your paperwork. So there's legitimate ways to get it to go to grease the wheels of the machine, but actual corruption I'm probably less likely to see. And they definitely will want to keep it hidden from foreigners, because if it gets out in a news article, then the Chinese government just loses face again.
Yeah. Can you explain that and this is one thing that is, I guess we could sort of go into sort of our next this flows nicely to our next topic, which is how is the Chinese mindset different to the West? And let's begin by discussing their obsession with saving face.
Yeah, I'm going to repeat some things that are in my video. So anyone that's seen it, sorry, but if you haven't experienced saving face culture before, it's hard to deal with, because it, especially coming from an Anglosphere mentality or even a Christian mentality of you don't lie, because lying is terrible, is very hard to deal with. Because I said before that what happens is, if there's something that goes wrong in the process, let's say I order food or I go to a place and I ask for a service, if it goes wrong, the responsibility for that is just gone. Nobody who is involved in the process will take responsibility for it. And I've even had some instances where the responsibility for that has been put back on me, as if I was involved in it. For example, like if food goes missing or it hasn't been delivered properly, it's my problem because I wasn't there to deal with it, or I wasn't dealing with it well enough. And the taking credit for things only happens when it's positive. And if somebody does something wrong, you always have to give them the opportunity to save face. They have to be able to say, oh, well, it wasn't all my fault. It was because of this, or it was because of this person who isn't here to take blame for it, or it was because of this accidental circumstance that we could never have predicted for. Especially as somebody in England, where, I mean, I don't know, because I've lived here for 5 years. I mean, the country's transforming so much every year that I don't know if it's even going to be the same place when I go back. But when I lived there, if a thing went wrong, whoever was responsible for that would have to take responsibility for it, would have to compensate, and would have to apologize, essentially.
So it's basically any accusations in China are met with "yeah, but."
Or not even yeah doesn't
but
even come into it. It begins with but. Like,
okay, it begins with but. Yeah, okay.
It's just like, but he was involved, but she was involved, but it was out of my control, but I wasn't there when that happened.
Yeah, and that is something which is very, you know, in Western societies, you'll get the yeah buts, as I call them. Sometimes they'll be like, yeah, but you know, there's these circumstances, or they'll just sort of accept it and say, yeah, okay, whatever. But yeah, that's not a thing in China.
No.
To what other things would you say about the Chinese mindset and culture that set it apart from the West? Either their attitudes towards the political structures, the attitudes towards President Xi, whatever it might be. How does the Chinese mindset diverge from the West?
I mean, to go from the saving face aspect, certainly within terms of like the nation, the state. I mean, going back to your series on fascism, I think Mussolini would love how the Chinese see the state, because they see it as they're all part of it, and if something goes wrong, they all dissipate the blame, and if something goes right, they can all take credit for it. And the only people I've met that are really anti-China are people who have been to the West and drank the worst of the globo homo Kool-Aid and come back wondering why China isn't a liberal democracy.
Yeah.
But most people are not. They don't have a nihilist attitude or a black-pilled attitude to their own state. They see China's prospering, they're getting richer, China's getting bigger. If there's a fight with another country, and I don't mean like a hot war, but like all the way throughout the trade war with America, they were like, oh, America's suffering, America's stupid, why are they doing this to us? Why are they hurting the Chinese people? We have no beef with the Americans.
Right. Why are they doing this to themselves too? Yeah.
I mean, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Like, why are they anti-Chinese business when we love to go to America? We love to buy American stuff.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, and that's something that, from a Western perspective, is a little hard to grasp. I think the attitudes that the Chinese have to the state is very, very different. So in America, you have sort of fractious sort of party politics and whatnot, and of course, really behind the scenes, we know they're two wings of the same bird, unfortunately, by and large. But in China, there's, of course, only the CCP. Now, the CCP has its own intrigues and factions like any other.
Yeah, it is factionated. It is factionated. And if you look back at the history of even during Mao's dynasty, I mean, that's a hilarious word to use, but it's true. Even during Mao's dynasty, he lost power in his own faction after the famine, and then with some political finagling regained it back again, and then Deng took over as well. So it is possible for a strong motivated group of people to get into the CCP and change how it operates, but they would never do it in the way that the West seems to be going, where they're anti their own culture. I don't think you could ever get into China. I mean, Mao managed to get in and be anti-Chinese culture, but I think it's tough now for you to ever get in into the CCP and on a bucket of, oh, we're going to keep immigration and just become part of a giant globo national alliance. It just wouldn't slide these days. But
yeah, okay.
Yeah, but the CCP has one doctrine, and the doctrine is to make China better. And regardless of what you think about China as your opposition, whether you're American or you're British or you're Australian, or even if you're Russian, because they don't always get on with the Russians either. The CCP do their job. They make China look like it's doing better. And it's even more difficult for them to undermine it because they have a completely controlled media class. So there's no vocal minority within the media to undermine their pro-China status.
Yeah, no, definitely. Because like I was saying with the Western mindset, they'll see the CCP and President Xi and be like, well, you guys are ruled by essentially a single party state, which is increasingly interested in controlling all aspects of your life. And President Xi is kind of like Mao 2.0 and like, why are you cool with this? Whereas with the Chinese mindset, all they have to do is look back at their grandparents and be like, yeah, we live like kings compared to the way our family lived just a generation or two ago. Things are getting better for us. And why do you want to stir the pot, Western subverter, essentially? So now, of course, there are some.
I know it's complete. I mean, people don't understand as well. Sorry, I don't want to interrupt you.
No, go ahead.
There's this mentality as well that why don't the Chinese just undermine their dictatorship and take over? And I'll be honest with you, they've made a deal with their government. They've given up the freedom. They have some basic freedom. They do have some privacy. It's not like total Big Brother state, although it's getting there. But in return for that, they do have complete security. The theft rate here is so low that I could leave my front door open and unlocked, and when I come back in a week, I probably would expect that somebody's just shut the door politely to make sure that nobody comes in. And they have a relationship with the police where they don't see the police as their oppressors. They see the police as their protectors. The police there are there to do a job and uphold the law, and they're not there to put the boot down and oppress them into conformity.
Right. Yeah. No, it's not the. They don't see the authorities as the jackboot stamping on the face at all. That is again one aspect of Chinese culture, which is very different from the West. So, particularly in Anglo countries, I would say, so the United States, England, we've always been sort of skeptical of the state sort of having too much power. But in China, it's almost seen as sort of like a virtue. They're like, yes, the state is doing such great things for us, and we're richer now. We're more secure, and so on and so forth. And the policeman is here to help and not to put me in jail for whatever reason. So it's of course
they've done something very smart as well. They've done something very smart, and I point this out to people a lot, that the Chinese government has made it so that the people are completely invested in the system now. So if the Communist Party gets upheaved, or if the current state of affairs begins to collapse, it's not like you just cut off the head of the king and the nation goes back to doing what it is. Everyone's linked to the state. So if it goes under, the entire society collapses.
Yeah, no, and that was extremely smart of the CCP to do that. Is they ended up with a situation where the people hitched their wagon to the CCP in a certain sense, in expectation of, progress. And the system, and particularly right now with China's vulnerable, I would say, sort of financial situation, and the economy, as far as I can see, being very focused on throughput rather than productivity. Unless you have a system sort of like the CCP, or unless you have an organization sort of like the CCP, holding everything together, economically speaking, they'd be in for kind of a hurting. Now, in my own opinion, that would probably be a good thing, just because I think the current Chinese economic situation is probably unsustainable and destined for a pretty big collapse, which is going to hurt them more down the line. But I think the party knows they've sort of created a situation where if their hands taken off the tiller for a moment, things could go sideways pretty quick. And I think the public is also aware of that. And they just don't want the good times to end, so they'll stick with it so long as there's results.
Yeah, and especially with current trends, I think that the CCP is just looking to outlast America. That's all they want to do right now is try and outlast the current cathedral regime in the US. And I mean, China's not printing 4 trillion yuan in the last 6 months. So I think with the way that things are looking, they might be able to achieve it if the American government doesn't stop trying to hurtle itself off the cliff face.
Yeah, no, I mean, that'll be interesting. Yeah, take bets. Who's going to last longer? The Anglo-American establishment or the CCP? Interesting.
Exactly.
Idea.
I mean,
yeah.
Culturally, I sent you that meme on Discord. I think culturally they're already a bit ahead of us because they saw we've got a choice. Do we subject our culture to foreign influence and follow along with this trend of multiculturalism, or do we just hold up our own culture and enforce it even more and become suspicious of outsiders? And they chose the choice that economically looks weird because they're not part of this free market choir that we've got going on in the West. But culturally, I mean, with whatever ash pile that they have after Mao, it's still their ash pile.
Yeah. No, that certainly seems to be the case. And, like I say, I'm definitely not a water carrier for the CCP by any means, but it seems like you got to recognize sort of the what they're doing that's smart and what they're doing that works. So there's like again with the economic situation, I think Radical Liberation, he did an excellent video sort of taking apart the looking at the economic structure of China, and it is very vulnerable. And the materialism from a cultural perspective, I think, is in the long run going to be very harmful to the Chinese. But they're not wrong about everything. And sort of their attitudes about, yes, we may have made some missteps, but because we want to save face, we're not going to admit it. But we're going to change. We're going to shift tact here with Deng Xiaoping. We're going to sort of make some reforms. We're going to try and dial back the radicalism a little bit. And what remains of China, we're going to preserve. We're going to preserve it.
Yeah, and they have seen the effects of. I mean, the Chinese, they actually get a nice supply of tuned Western news that shows the West like this collapsing pile, and most of the Chinese people have nothing, either sympathy or revelry towards the Western position, especially with what happened in the US over the last 6 to 12 months. They see it as it looks like a state on the last legs, and we can take over that if they do collapse.
Yeah, no, definitely. They and that's one of the nice things about any regime which is undemocratic is they can essentially afford to sort of take a more long-term perspective and strategy on these sorts of things. Whereas, and in democracy, you always got the next election to worry about. And in the United States, of course, I think democracy is largely a sham in most countries. Hashtag, I am not questioning the veracity of the November 6th election, YouTube. But democracy in general, I think, is just sort of a smokescreen by which the powers that be can have plausible deniability about what's really going on. So, but of course, there is sort of some instability. So you'll get characters like Trump in there who are like, no, this wasn't the plan, and they'll seek to deal with it in quotes as best as they can, and in order to get back on track. But the nice thing about an undemocratic regime is it can be a lot more sort of direct and unified in sort of where it wants to take things and how to address problems in the long term. So, yeah, that'll be something really interesting to see going forward, is sort of how Chinese subterfuge and strategery is going to play out over the next while. Now, on to our...
Okay. Sorry, just one last point on that is as well that if the economic prosperity does stop, at least the Chinese have still have plenty of unifying factors that are holding their culture together. Whereas current England, if the economic prosperity of England stops, are the economic migrants going to have any unifying factor with the people that already live there? I mean, it's a good question.
Probably no.
Absolutely. Yeah, probably not. They'll probably get on their boats and sail back across the channel.
Yeah. I guess sort of before I go to my last question here, we got a comment from Mold Buggy and MK Ultra Victim. Thoughts on the Uyghur situation?
It's a good question, and I don't really know how to answer it, because obviously as an active Christian, I absolutely condemn any exploitation of people, especially with the stories coming out of borderline slavery and population replacement. But living in China, I'd have no idea that was happening if I didn't have connections to Western media, which I mean, I'm hastily trying to cut because I'm hurriedly trying to ride the tiger through our current horrible overtone of low politics. But I wouldn't know anything about the Uyghurs had I not heard it on Western news, because there's no way that any of that would get through the firewall. The government would stamp that out immediately, if anybody tried to publish an article on it.
Yeah. No, definitely. And I think that's the thing. A lot of people will want to blame, quote, the Chinese. But as you just said, a lot of the information that is sort of available to us in the West is not available to people in China. So they won't. Yeah. There's a good chance that, most people in China might not have even heard anything about the situation with the Uyghurs. So
it's actually I've got a funny story on that, because I remember one time I was in a bar and I had been on a holiday to Vietnam, and I was talking to somebody Chinese about Vietnam and how in the north they have quite a harsh suspicion of white foreigners, but in the south they're quite welcoming. And she said, yeah, and they have the same opinion of the Chinese, and I have no idea why. And I turned to her and I said, well, it's because China tried to invade North Vietnam just after the Americans left. And she didn't know it had happened. And she outright denied it at first, saying, no, that's Western propaganda. That's rubbish spread online to make the Chinese regime look bad. And then when we put evidence of it in front of her that was sort of irrefutable, she then said that it was like a Chinese victory and that it was good for the Chinese and they were just doing it for humanitarian reasons.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to watch somebody pivot like that on a dime for a regime.
Oh yeah, no, it's always humanitarian reasons. Yeah. So another comment here. This talk is very acceleration pilled. I don't know if I'd say that. Mostly, again, this talk is mostly about China, not particularly about the West, although we have sort of discussed its relation to the West. I think more than anything, it's just sort of realpolitik pilled. I don't know. Because
I'm not sure that I'm acceleration pill, because
yeah,
I don't think that anything good will come from. I mean, I don't know about America because I'm not personally invested in America and I don't know the best way to get them out of the situation. But for the British, there's at least some vestiges of a white pill that's coming out of Brexit. If not the fact that we've got other looming demographic problems.
yeah, no, I would agree. I tend to be sort of, as I understand it, kind of against accelerationism, just for the mere fact that I have a family, and I don't want to, see things spiral out of control too quickly. I guess so in that sense, I guess I'm more partial to gradual decline. But if we're talking about uh, accelerating and changing the political structure, yeah, that would be good. So right now, all I'm concerned about really is, providing for my family, taking care of them, raising my son in a, hopefully a godly masculine manner, and protecting them as much as I might from whatever shit is coming down the pike. But yeah, I mean, if we could have some sort of legitimate change to our political situation, that'd be great. And I would prefer not to get caught in the middle of a turf war between Globo, Homo, and the CCP. I would, and I don't really want to see either side in that conflict win.
What a terrible conflict that would be. Like, I'd rather not choose a side in that conflict, if I'm honest.
No, yeah. In that situation, I'd just be like, yeah, I'm.
I mean, if both sides lose, the world wins, I guess. But
yeah,
there's no way it would be a lose-lose situation, because honestly, the CCP has its problems with Globo Homo right now. I don't know if you saw the article. I thought it was hilarious, where the Chinese claimed that Chinese celebrities were being planted by the CIA, because I think I forgot to mention it, but I was going to say, for the China is based one, the Chinese male celebrities are totally feminized here. I remember one of my teenage students showed me a picture of a Chinese celebrity, and I was like, is that a guy or a girl? Which one is that? Like,
yeah, I mean, what is this thing with with East Asian androgynous pretty boy men? I really like. It's in Korea, it's in Japan, and apparently now it's also in China. Is this just sort of like bizarre, weird Western subterfuge, or what the hell is this?
I'm not sure, because I have noticed among Chinese women that there's this kind of swingy trend where they either prefer these like hyper, I wouldn't say hyper feminine, but girlish.
These dandies. Yeah, these dandies.
These girlish men, or they prefer like some 6-foot Mongolian brute, like traditional masculinity. It tends to swing, but I definitely see where the Chinese would have got that accusation from, because so many Chinese teenage girls love these girly boys, and I just don't understand the appeal at all.
Yeah, no, and for those of you who like anime in the audience, this may be this may trigger you, but I think there's something there's something about the corrosive effects of anime in China, because I was talking to a student of mine, and they really like manga. I was like, oh, okay, cool. Like, what do you like? And again, it's this sort of like this sort of the image that they get of guys in this media is these like androgynous, soft, like dudes, and it's just very strange. It's not the, like you said, it's not the mongoloid like horse rider off the steps ready to pillage and take the women folk. I mean, that's not cool anymore for the women. That's not what they want.
The thing is, I think it's the opposite problem to the West, where it's not like this top-down infringement of, no, you will accept this. We're going to put it everywhere so that you just feel like you're excluded from the media. No, this has been like a bottom-up choice where the Chinese consumer has chosen to get behind these completely feminized men, and the government hates it. They hate it, and they're actively looking for ways to remasculize the population because the Chinese government is quite worried there's going to be a hot war, and they want their male population ready for that outcome.
A sturdy male population, yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, yeah. Apparently, this thing has sparked some conversation among the weebs in the audience. I'm just looking here; it's kind of funny. So I guess sort of on to my last question, and this is just something of personal interest of mine. But what can you say about the spread of? We've already talked about some maybe negative aspects of Western culture that are, affecting China. But one of the positive things of Western culture, the most positive thing, in my opinion, is its Christian heritage. And to what extent can you? Yes, exactly. the most based. And what can you say about the spread of Christianity within China today?
It's definitely happening. I'm not sure about the poor in China, because obviously it's difficult for me to just walk out of the city and make conversation with the poor, irrespective of my Chinese level. They're always going to view me as a bit weird. But Christianity is here, and it's a very private thing. I know that the kids are going to tell me that they're Christian, but if they tell anyone else they're Christian, that's up for debate. And the more affluent, I wouldn't say the richest in China have time for Christianity, but it certainly seems like the middle classes are very Christian. Like maybe they've seen this void of lack of spirituality and felt like something should be there.
Yeah, that would make sense, because on the one hand, it's the middle class who's the most, what you can say, deracinated and wealth obsessed and ladder climbing and all that sort of stuff. But on the other hand, I think they're the ones who probably suffer the most from disillusionment with the world, in terms of.
I mean, they're also the ones that suffered hardest under communism too, because the richest guys got in with the Communist Party, and the poorest guys were machined for the Communist Party, whereas the middle class were the ones that were just ripped into and persecuted.
Yeah, exactly. And but I think sort of having that sort of that experience, and as you said, of sort of having the middle class for a long time sort of being on the outs, and then also sort of coping with modernity and urbanization and deracination and being sort of taken away from your culture, and having this spiritual void and official atheism in the Communist Party and so on and so forth. It would strike me as likely that this would be a demographic who would be open to sort of new spiritual experiences. So the idea that it sort of spreads among the middle class, I find in China specifically, I find believable. And yeah, just as like one example, I was talking with one of my students a while ago, and I was like, yeah, so, we're asking, basic conversation stuff. What do you want to be when you grow up? And he told me he wanted to be a pastor. And I was like, oh, based, that's cool.
that you got one base kid there. I'd be lucky to see a pastor kid.
Yeah. So like immediately I heard that, and I like perk up a little bit. I'm like, there's hope, If there's Chinese kids who want to be Christian pastors, like all is not lost.
It's not entirely alien to here as well, because I mean, they do have a large minority, not the Uyghurs. I can't remember them off the top of my head. Somebody might be able to get it before me, but there is a large minority of Islamic Islamic Chinese in the northern provinces who are like a layover from the Mongolian eras. And I remember I was told that the reason that they tend to get away with their faith is because they're Chinese first and Muslim second. But I'm definitely kind of sus about that because they wear the headscarves and or they eat halal food and they don't drink alcohol, and it does separate them from the Chinese a lot. So I can see that kind of mentality would be even easier for Christianity because it you don't tend to cut yourself off as badly, and it's something that you can keep as personal, but it does still fill the void of spirituality that exists here. I do see why the CCP is terrified of it, though, because in China, the highest authority is the state, and the police that are like the figure of the state. And as soon as you start becoming Christian, it's like, well, you've chosen something higher than the state. So you're not Chinese first, you're Christian first.
Yeah. No, and I think that was, if we look at history, that was sort of one of the problems that the Roman state had with Christians in the first place, is that they had something that they elevated above the emperor, and their loyalty was and was loyal to and were loyal to first before Caesar. So I can see that unfortunately becoming an issue with as time goes on for the Chinese. Here's a question here from Farbod M. To what extent is the Christianity a fashionable Western thing to be in China?
I'd hesitate to accuse it of such motivation because it really is a change of perspective for the Chinese. Like, they're not a church-going people. I've said before, they're not particularly a community-based people. For them, the family is at the heart of everything, and it goes out from there. But I just can't see as well. It would be far more vogue to be in with the Globo Homo crowd and, oh, that's the vogue Western thing than Christianity, to be honest. I think they would see, like, if they were going to get into Western culture, Christianity would be one of the last vestiges that they see.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I think there is, and not just in China, but all over the world, a spiritual longing in modernity. And if they encounter something which they feel is authentic and true, I could see why they'd cling to it. And also, China does have some sort of connection to Christianity in the past. I mean, it's not really well known in the West, but there was a big civil war in China in the 1800s called the Taiping Rebellion. And that involved millions of people. And the leader of the Taiping Rebellion was basically had these bizarre, weird, like pseudo-Christian Gnostic beliefs about how he was like the brother of Jesus Christ or something. And he had, I think he called his kingdom was like the heavenly kingdom of Taiping or something like that. And so
the thing is,
there is a connection going back before now to at least some shoulder rubbing with Christianity, at least in parts of China.
Yeah, like the thing is as well that Confucianism and Taoism are basically like these. Well, Confucianism isn't inherently spiritual anyway. It's more like a way of living in the world, and less like a spiritual doctrine. It mentions spirituality in passing, and it talks about respect towards the ancestors, and it does talk about heaven and heavenly beings, and to some extent God as well. But it never sets out a doctrine for following like heavenly virtues other than conducting yourself on earth and how to be a good kingdom and how to be a better person. And Taoism's more, it meshes well with Christianity in a way that other religions don't. And people need to understand as well that people think of China and they think, oh, well, that's Buddhism, right? But even Buddhism is an outside religion for China. Buddhism isn't inherently Chinese.
Yeah, no, that's true. Buddhism originated in the Indian subcontinent. It's not Chinese, that's for sure. I'm just looking here at the time. I need to get going for a family lunch here in a bit, but I'm just scrolling through the comments. This is funny. It's apparently conspiracies about the originations of anime. So a story that back in the 60s, there was a gay CIA agent in Japan who had a sideline in promoting effeminate fashion styles for men, justified on the principle that it will undermine the justified military aesthetic of the Japanese. So there you go.
Yeah.
And the popularity of manga and anime had the effect of spreading these fashions to neighboring countries. Is it true? Don't know. I don't know either. But that wouldn't surprise me if it was true, I guess. So I'm not going to say if that's right or wrong.
But
you're just
telling us American at it again.
Yeah, you're just some guy telling me this, man. But based off what I know, how the CIA operates and sort of their history, I would nothing that the CIA would do would surprise me at all, including this. No. So whether it's running drugs, exploiting children for blackmail purposes on politicians, whatever it is, trying to make Chinese women effeminate, Chinese men effeminate or Japanese men effeminate. Yeah, I mean, it's all. I think it's all for them.
I remember hearing a good meme about the CIA, that the CIA is so bad at their job that everyone knows what a terrible job they're doing. Whereas the Chinese Secret Service, people still don't know what the name of the Chinese Secret Service is or what it does.
Yeah, we just say Beijing as a catchphrase for it. Yeah, Beijing's doing this, Beijing's doing that. What I read is that the Taiping literally means heavenly kingdom. Is that true? I'd like to know. Northern Man, any take on this?
I'm pretty sure that is the translation of Taiping, because Tai tends to mean sky, but it also means, in another translation, it means heaven. But that could be it could also mean something else, because the problem is I've learned simplified Chinese, and traditional characters used to teach their esoteric meaning first and then their useful meaning as second, whereas simplified Chinese is basically the total materialist view of the Chinese language.
Gotcha. Yeah,
but it wouldn't surprise me.
Chinese.
It wouldn't surprise me, because there is a heavy spiritual aspect to the emperorship and the government of China. From Confucius, even back 1,000 years before Confucius, there was a spiritual aspect. They made sacrifices to God. They prayed to a god. They respected heaven as the utmost place of virtue. I mean, obviously that's been dead and buried for a long time now, because the Sun Yat-sen's revolution saw fit to just kill all that stuff.
Yeah, and there was always this in Chinese culture, there was this idea of the mandate of heaven, which sort of applied to the emperor, and he was sort of like, he wasn't a god emperor or anything, but he had a mandate from heaven to sort of see to it that he executes the orders from above in a certain way. So to bring the values from the heavenly realm and the edicts from heaven down to earth to a certain extent.
I was reading this passage from Mungza, Mencius, as he's known in English, and it's something to the akin to, if a righteous leader is righteous and benevolent, what does he have to care about the opinion of the masses? He has every heavenly right to exercise his power for good, and that's totally anathema to the Western idea of power, that it comes up from the people. To the ancient Chinese, it was like,
Yeah.
no, this guy's been chosen to be the emperor, and he will do what's in your best interest, whether you like it or not.
Yeah, and that was, in fairness, that used to be sort of the Western conception as well, with the idea of the great chain of being and so on and so forth. But unfortunately, due to liberalism and democracy and equality, notions of equality, we've lost all that.
Yeah.
So
I mean, even traditional old Blighty, the royal family is totally compromised.
yeah, oh, blighty. So
I
I'm just like,
remember.
oh,
Sorry,
sorry.
I don't
No,
want. I don't want to go too much off on this tangent, but I
go ahead.
remember they made a big. There was that terrible Netflix series that I knew that's got even worse as it gone along. But the first season was okay, about the crown and Elizabeth, and I remember there was this big scene in it where she says, "Oh, you're not allowed to give your opinion because the people don't want to hear your opinion." And I'm like, what about all the monarchists in England that actually want you to be the leader of the country, Lizzie? Like, can we
Yeah.
have your opinion, please?
Yeah. Give us your opinion, please. Lead. You're a monarch. Rule. You should
Yeah.
rule. You're a monarch. Yeah.
You everybody knows that the reason she's carried on as a monarch is because she believes she was divinely chosen. What, does she just believe that she was divinely chosen to just go along with whatever the British people say?
Yeah, no, that's ridiculous. So I guess I'm going to have to wrap it up here. Family's getting ready to go have a nice Sunday lunch with the in-laws. But before I go and close off this conversation, I see there's been about 21 people watching this stream. And if all of you would go over and subscribe to Northern Man's channel, which is linked in the description, that would be great. Then we basically double his, we double the amount of people sub to his channel overnight, and that would be awesome. He's got some really great material. It's very digestible for a Western audience, and he addresses some really interesting points. So I would encourage all of you to go out there and subscribe to his channel and check it out, definitely. And also as well, if you have not subscribed to this channel, Mr. Patriarch, I would highly encourage you to do so as well. Hopefully you can stick around. I have, as he mentioned earlier, I did a series on fascism, and I'm right now in the middle of going through the entirety of Machiavelli's The Prince. So stay tuned for more info on that. Northern Man, do you got any closing words you'd like to say before we call it quits?
I would say I appreciate the ego boost, but I read a passage in Confucius that the superior man does not look for fame, but looks to do good, irrespective of being unknown. So, I mean, I always describe it as if I was in a room of 10 people and they were all listening to what I was saying, would I care if it was more? But please go and subscribe by all means. And please subscribe to Mr. Patriarch too. His series are great, and I mean, I don't want to get you targeted by Susan, but your series on the big F word I really enjoyed, because it was a nice non-biased take of the actual system, rather than just, no, this regime is the hellspawn and we must burn it.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who studied history, I think even things that are a little more, let's say, touchy subjects in our modern age, they deserve to be sort of looked at in sort of the time in which they would be understood. And the big F word is one such. And I'm just always interested in sort of the losers in history and sort of how they might have perceived themselves. And I guess apparently we're all North FC now, according to Farbot M. So.
I can't officially give out that card until you eat something wrapped in pastry and tea so sugared the spoon stands up in it. But if you would like to send me a video, I can clarify it for the Northern Council.
That's great. Yeah, you talk to all the other Northern guys and sort it out amongst yourselves. There we go. All right. Thank you very much, everyone, for tuning in. This has been Mr. Patriarch with Northern Man discussing Is China Based? Patriarch out.